Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on 960 AM or streamed online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com. Diversity is a major issue. It has been for a long period of time in Canada, but I think probably even more so since the incidents in Minneapolis a couple of months ago. And Wendy Cukier, who is a professor at Ryerson University, is probably one of Canada's foremost experts on diversity. She has more degrees than you can imagine. She's got an MA and an MBA from the University of Toronto, a PhD from Schulich School of Business, York University. She's got honorary doctorates from Laval University in medicine, dentistry, and nursing, and an honorary doctorate of laws from Concordia University. She leads the Diversity Institute at Ryerson, and I'm not sure whether she does today, but she has led the research and innovation in the past, and she's really one of Canada's leading people on innovation. I've had the pleasure of being on the same podium with her in the past talking about innovation, and she's very knowledgeable and very bright. She's also big in gun control, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing her before in gun control. But recently, she had a whole conference on diversity, and what I want to do is find out what happened at the conference. So Dr. Wendy Cukier, how are you, and welcome to our show.
Great, thanks for having me.
I pronounced your last name wrong, didn't I?
Yeah, but everybody does.
What's the right pronunciation, please?
Cukier, as if it were.
Cukier.
Yes.
I apologize. So tell me about this conference that you had, and you presented a paper, I understand. What was the outcome and recommendations?
Well, we've had a number of webinars recently focusing on representation of women and other groups, both on boards as well as in entrepreneurship. And so the big paper that I think you're referring to, Brian, looked at representation on boards in 8 cities across country, looking at corporate boards, looking at hospitals, agencies, boards and commissions, educational institutions, charities, and so on, and simply counted how many women there were, how many racialized people there were, and specifically how many Black people there were. And it won't come as any surprise to you that all 3 groups are underrepresented. Women are making progress. We've been doing this study for 10 years, and there's no question progress has been being made, but racialized people are pretty much stalled in terms of their representation in leadership roles, specifically on boards, and Black people are almost invisible.
Invisible, really?
1,600 corporate board members we looked at in 4 cities. We found 13 Black people.
So what is this? Is this systemic racism that has been sort of the word on TV and in the media for the last couple of months, or is it lack of opportunities that Black people, African Canadians have? What is it?
It's I think short answer is systemic racism permeates almost every institution. Doesn't mean it's intentional, but it's often reflected in policies and practices that just reinforce the status quo and prevent women, racialized people, and particularly Black people from getting access to positions that they're well qualified for.
So how do we change things?
Well, I think the first thing is to name the problem. You probably remember when Donovan Bailey, the Olympic runner, said that racism was a problem in Canada, and he was almost drummed out of the country, because Canadians really pride themselves in being better than Americans on this issue and on many other issues, as you know, and arguably we are. But that doesn't mean racism isn't a problem. I mean, we did a study with Environics a few years ago, interviewed 1,500 Black people who lived in the GTA, and half of them said they did not think Canada was better than the United States. That came really shock to many people. Half of the Black people living in the GTA do not think Canada is any better than the States. And what Donovan Bailey was quoted saying recently is racism is a problem in Canada, it's just politer. So I think that the first step to solving any problem is to acknowledging the problem. You can't deny that systemic racism is embedded in most of our major institutions, including universities. And, we try to embrace diversity and inclusion. We have people like me who talk about diversity and inclusion, but there's no question, even within universities, there are many barriers that racialized students face, faculty, staff, and so on, that we have to really tackle. So I think that the very first thing is to name the problem. And one of the contributions we feel our research does is it shows pretty clearly that there is a problem, that it's not in people's heads, it's not hyperbole, it's pretty serious. And we've been doing this study of representational leadership and boards for a number of years. And the thing, I think there were a couple of stats that really made me absolutely convinced that it wasn't that there aren't qualified people, that it was that it's the policies and the practices. And the first thing
Can I interrupt?
Sorry.
We're going to take a break, and let's get into the stats after the message, okay?
Sure.
So we're going to take a quick break and come back more with Dr. Wendy Cukier in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The topic tonight is diversity. We're chatting with Dr. Wendy Cukier, who is a professor at Ryerson University. She specializes in innovation and diversity, and she heads something called, what is it called? The Diversity Institute? That's right. Okay. So you were about to tell me some stats that you felt were very compelling. What are those stats that prove to you that diversity doesn't exist or is an issue?
So in Toronto, half the population, in fact, more than 51% now, is racialized. And half the population is white. If you look at women on boards, we're making progress. But in the population, for every white woman, there's a racialized woman. If you look at corporate boards in particular, for every racialized woman, there are 13 white women. That is not a stat that you can explain away by differences in education or background or language or anything else. That is something that reveals that, while women are making progress, it's primarily white women, and white women are actually replicating exactly the same practices that we saw kept women off boards, which means that we tend to associate with people who are like us. So while we may support and promote and sponsor women on boards, white women are more likely to promote, sponsor, and advocate for women
White
who are
woman.
them. So
is this a genetic thing that we tend to associate with and promote people that look like us, our same gender and same skin tone, or is this something that's a learned behavior over time?
Yeah, I think there's no question racism is learned, and the tendency to associate with people who have similar background is something that's socialized. There's a big difference if you look at my experience. I'm a bit older than you versus your experience versus our kids. Like my daughter has never commented on the race, the gender identity, sexual preferences, religion of any of her friends. Like it is just so not an issue.
So is this just something that time solves? When you think about when I was growing up in elementary school, we made fun, it was completely inappropriate, but we made fun of Eastern Europeans as an example, or Southern Europeans. And that seems so completely inappropriate today and so old. Like who would ever dream of making a comment about some of those? So and today you don't. And I don't know if you do surveys to find out whether Polish people or Italian people or people from Newfoundland have got their proportionate share of boards, but it's almost irrelevant. So is that just something that time will solve? Because your daughter is one great example.
Time will solve it. We see progress over time, But, you know, as has been pointed out, for women to get parity will take another 50 years. So I think there are some people who are just a little bit impatient and not willing to wait a century to see equity. So I agree with you that each generation, for the most part, seems to be more advanced in terms of their understanding of these issues. And I learn things every day from my team at the Diversity Institute, because most of them are several generations younger than me. But I think we have to take action. And, you know, the other point I wanted to make is that often you hear, and I'm sure, you know, there are boards you probably associated with, Brian, and if you went and said, we need more women or Black people or racialized people, they'd say, oh, we'd love to have more, but there are none, or there are none with the right qualifications, or we don't know anybody. And my answer to that is that our research shows very clearly that if you don't have any women, you don't have any racialized people, you don't have any Black people, it's not that they don't exist, it's that you're not trying hard enough. And the reason we know that is because we found that over 15% of corporate boards had hit 40% women in terms of the representation. And a proportion of corporate boards have 20% racialized minorities, and then others have none. We call those the corporate zeros. But if you see some that have hit 20 or 40% in comparison to some who have none, it's very clear it isn't the pool, it isn't the availability of qualified people, it's the intentionality, it's the policies, it's the processes. And if your processes on the board have been, there's a vacancy, who do we know? Oh, I golf with this guy, or I shop with this woman, or I went to private school with this person. Chances are you're going to just keep replicating what you've already got. But if you look very carefully at the qualifications and the skills that you need in the current environment, when markets are changing dramatically, globalization means international knowledge is incredibly valuable, et cetera, you'll start to open up more possibilities.
So I'm part of the visiting faculty at the DeGroote School of Business Directors College, and I go to some of their sessions. And I don't know what the statistic is, but my sense is that it's very female and it's very racialized. And so the director's education that people are getting is for everybody. If people are getting educated and they got the experience, is it just that we're not choosing them?
I would say yes, and I'll give you, so it's very interesting because that program is very, very different from what you would see with the ICD, for example, in Toronto. And part of the problem with some of the board training programs is they're really expensive. And so if somebody is not already in a senior position, they're often blocked. But I'll give you a good example, and he gave me permission to use his name. Gervin Fearon, not sure if you know him. He's now the president of Brock University, was the president of Brandon University. He was the head of the Chang School at Ryerson, which is a revenue generating division of the university. Previously, very celebrated career, PhD in economics. He makes me look like a slacker. PhD in economics. He is also a certified public accountant, right? He has done the ICD. He has served on many, many nonprofit boards. He has never been invited to join a corporate board. Makes no sense to me. And admittedly, the seats on corporate boards are hard to get. And admittedly, the lack of term limits for directors often, makes the number of new seats unavailable. But please don't tell me there are no qualified Black people waiting to serve on corporate boards. So again, I would say that it's intentionality. It's not the pool. And a lot of those, frankly, a lot of those directors programs are really good for people who are already part of the social networks, who have the social capital, who already have access and want to refine their skills. I don't think there's much evidence at all that they're good pathways into those circles. And social capital networks, who you know rather than what you know, remains one of the most important determinants of whether or not you're going to get on corporate boards.
So you're recommending affirmative action effectively?
Effectively. I mean, I think it's a question of setting targets. I'm not a believer in quotas for women or anybody else because I think they can really backfire. But I do think that transparency has big impact. The federal government's new legislation, Bill C-25, requires all federally incorporated companies to now comply or explain about representation of women, racialized people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities on their boards and on their senior teams, and to report on the strategy that they have around diversity and inclusion or explain why they don't have one. I think that's going to shine a light on many of these practices because for a lot of organizations, it's something they just haven't thought about. I mean, I was on Women's College Hospital Board for a long time, and we struggled with the Diversity Institute. We struggled with the diversity issue. Clearly, we didn't struggle with gender. It was all women. In fact, when I was chair, we brought on the first men, which was, our big diversity move. But I remember some of those conversations that were clearly informed by people who were accustomed to associating with people just like them. And I remember one of the comments was, we really aren't racist. We really want more diversity on the board. But Wendy, we need people on the board who have money and connections. Half the population in the GTA is racialized. Do we think they have no money or connections? So, when you see those things happen, even in very progressive organizations, and mind you, this was a number of years ago, it's very clear that a lot of this has to do with people just not being aware of what the issues are, not having a clear line of sight on what they can do. And that's, one of the things the Diversity Institute does is really focus on very practical, concrete things organizations can do. Help them actually reach out to organizations that will help them identify people. I mean, we now have a database of thousands of women and racialized people who are currently sitting on boards in Canada. And if you're a corporate board, it makes sense to me that you would start to look at the boards of hospitals and universities and agencies, boards and commissions for the kind of talent that you need.
Is any of this the fault of the women? And so let me ask you this question. I was part of a research study at Harvard Business School, and it was taking a look at why females at Harvard Business School didn't get the proportionate share of the top marks, didn't get the proportionate share of scholarships, or the proportionate share of professorships and things like that. And I'm not completely familiar with the results, but it was almost as if they were saying you've got to follow. I think it was Sherry Sandberg's lean in ideas that females didn't put up their hand, they didn't participate as much, they held back, they were far less assertive, they didn't make their points known, etc. And the males were the opposite of all that. And even female professors were surprised when the analysis was done that found that they picked on males a lot more often for participation and gave disproportionate high marks to males. So
yeah, and
what
women venture capitalists tend to pick men just like the other men do. So I wouldn't characterize it as blame, because I think we're a product of socialization to a very large extent. And, we have to become more aware of what those forces are. But we know that the standardized testing in grade 3 for little girls and little boys in Toronto shows that little girls, and you have both, right? You have boys and girls, as I recall, right? Little girls outperform little boys in grade 3 in math and in English. But when they are asked, are you good at math? Are you good at English? Little boys are more likely to say yes. And that, what I would characterize as a confidence gap, is very much a product of socialization, where girls, not me, of course, but most girls are socialized to be compliant, pleasers, avoid conflict. Modesty is a virtue. If you are assertive, you're bossy. Like, boy, I have never met a man who was ever called bossy. Bossy is a term you use for assertive women. And that takes a toll. And you would know that whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about coaches in sports, whether we're talking about Wendy becoming the Vice President of Research and Innovation, most women, not all, but most women, even if they have 90% of the qualifications, won't put their name in. Whereas a man with 50% of the qualifications will say, how hard can it be?
So what do you think of our new Minister of Finance?
Yeah, most women will not put their name in to run for political office, will not put their name in for a promotion, will not put their name in to become a coach, et cetera, unless someone taps them on the shoulder and says, you should apply for this. This is a good job for you. And I can tell you, like, I am no shrinking violet. But I would never have applied for the Vice President of Research and Innovation at Ryerson had it not been for my colleagues coming together and saying, you do this. We need you to do this. We are putting your name in to do this. We are signing a letter to nominate you. I wouldn't have done it. And in fact, when I think of any of the jobs that I've taken in my entire life, apart from my initial job at Ryerson, it's always because someone has tapped me on the shoulder and said, Wendy, you should do this.
Okay, so you are, as you say, not a shrinking violet. You're very confident. Why is that? Were you socialized by your parents, by society, to think you were less competent?
I think it's, women get signals at every turn that they are less than. Women who are, if you're a strong, it's a double whammy, right? Because the images of leadership are so highly gendered that if you're a woman who displays characteristics that are normally associated with men, i.e. you're decisive, you're assertive, whatever, you're not likable, right? You're not.
The Donald Trump comment about that nasty woman.
Yeah, you're bossy, you're obnoxious, whereas exactly the same characteristics displayed by a man are evidence of leadership. And this pattern, I'm not complaining based on my own experience. The research shows this really, really clearly, that in spite of people's best intentions, our assumptions about what it means to be a leader, what it means to be an expert, what it means to be, prime minister, are highly gendered and highly cultural specific. And you see it in, like, you do a lot of work with innovation and entrepreneurs and so on. You see it in pitching competitions. You see it when people present business cases. Women are asked different questions than men. Male founders are selected because venture capitalists are betting on potential. Women are refused because they don't have a perfect business plan worked out. Like the embeddedness of these assumptions is so deep that you really have to be intentional if you're going to try to overcome them. And we see it in teaching evaluations. Even female students prefer male teachers. We see it in supervisory roles. Women will accept certain kinds of direction, criticism, instruction from men that they will not accept from other women. And you hear this from, I've heard this from everyone from surgeons to partners in law firms, where they find their biggest struggles are often with women in support functions who just have such a gendered view of what a surgeon should be or what a lawyer should be, they have real trouble adapting to women in those roles.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Wendy Cukier. She's a professor at Ryerson, and she just issued a paper and chaired a conference on diversity. We're going to take a break and come back more with Dr. Cukier in just a minute. Stay with us.
Hi.
Well, we're back with Dr. Wendy Cukier, professor at Ryerson, head of the Diversity Institute. We're talking about diversity. We've spoken a fair amount about gender. And actually, I asked you the one question. And so let me ask you again. Just today, a new Minister of Finance has been appointed, female. I'm not sure if she's the first female Minister of Finance, but isn't that going to be breaking some glass ceilings?
I think for sure. I mean, I think that, even in gender balanced cabinets, often the serious portfolios tended to go to men. So things like economics, foreign affairs, finance for sure. It's the first time Canada's had a female finance minister at the federal level. We've seen them in, I think Janice McKinnon in Saskatchewan was one of the first provincial finance ministers. So this is definitely another glass ceiling that's been broken. But of course, she was, foreign affairs minister, which is typically a very male environment as well.
And had a great reputation for how she dealt with Donald Trump in the NAFTA negotiations.
Yeah.
So she proved herself. And I think that's one of the keys is you got to give people opportunity to test them and prove themselves.
No question.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about race. Obviously the murder or the killing, I'll call it a murder, of George Floyd in Minneapolis a couple of months ago has raised the issue of race relations to a state that it hasn't been at for decades, probably not this high since Martin Luther King. Is that good? Is that bad? Could this be the catalyst for major change? When you think about all the media, the defund police, the comments about systemic racism, what do you think is going to happen with race relations in the world, but specifically in Canada?
So it's it's definitely a challenging time on multiple levels. But for me, what's promising is for the first time that I can recall, a prime minister used the words systemic racism. For the first time I recall, commissioner of the RCMP corrected herself and said systemic racism existed in policing. And so to me, seeing people in charge of major institutions use those words is significant progress because, as I mentioned at the outset, I remember very clearly when Donovan Bailey dared say Canada was racist and or that racism existed in Canada, I think it's what he said, and was soundly criticized by everybody everywhere. So I think, awareness is pretty important. I think the emergence of things like Black North, which has, I think, last count over 300 large organizations supporting it and making explicit commitments to Black, Indigenous, and people of color representation on boards and in senior leadership roles and in terms of their procurement policies and so on. I think that's very significant, and it isn't, of course, these things ebb and wane. And of course, we always run the risk that someone, puts out their statement and then goes back to sleep. But I've seen evidence in large organizations of a kind of awareness and commitment that I've never seen before. And I've been doing this work for 30 years. So, will we get everything we should get when we should get it? Probably not. But I think we'll make progress much more quickly, ironically, because so many people saw the murder in real time of a Black man at the hands of police. And it wasn't It wasn't something that was a matter of interpretation or he said, someone else said. It was there in front of our eyes. So I think that has raised, and I didn't actually see the video, but I do think that sometimes things are so undeniable, they do actually spark change. I think that the other thing that's really interesting is, as dreadful as the impact of COVID has been in many, many ways, it has also shown us that things we said we couldn't do, you know, e-learning, e-health, e-government,
e-law,
have been accelerated at a pace that nobody imagined possible. I mean, the universities have resisted online education for years. I started my career working on issues related to teleeducation, telehealth, and so on. And I've watched for more than 30 years where technologies and solutions have been available, but institutional barriers and preferences and politics have got in the way. And then over a weekend, we transitioned to an online institution. So when you see that level of change possible, I think it opens up people's minds to what actually could be done. And I really am encouraged also by the discussions of inclusive innovation and how we need to rebuild better. And there seems to be a lot of appetite for actually challenging things that we thought we couldn't do, because the evidence is where there's a will, there's a way.
What do you mean innovation? How are things going to be different in innovation?
Well, because I think to me, addressing diversity and inclusion is just a different form of innovation. It requires change at multiple levels. It requires change of institutions, of the environment, of our assumptions, of culture, and of individual behavior. It's a form of innovation. It's not related to technology, but it's innovation nevertheless. And so I think that when you see the potential of changes happening quickly, it starts to challenge your assumptions that, we need to wait another 10 years, or, we can't do things quickly. We can do things quickly when we want to or we need to. And I think that what we need to do is apply the same sense of urgency to issues around diversity and inclusion, and probably to things like climate change that we applied to responding to the COVID crisis and finding PPEs and shifting to digital. Does that make sense?
I spoke with
possibilities.
I spoke with Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, or parliamentary leader of the Green Party, former leader of the Green Party, and she actually was interested. She talked about COVID-19 being this sort of crucible where we tested a whole bunch of things and found out a whole bunch of different things. We talked about, guaranteed annual income, because some of the CERP programs are sort of working like a guaranteed annual income. We talked about long-term care and how we've learned a lot more bad things about long-term care than we ever would dream of learning in our worst nightmares. Transit, density, parkland, climate change, you go through the list. And I do think that the fact that, I'm shocked that you never saw the video, because I think I probably saw the video of that gentleman's death/murder probably a dozen times on different media. Lots of people were at home watching news media, and so and probably watching news media more than they ever did before, and so they were exposed to that video probably more than they would have been exposed if they were commuting 2 hours a day to their job and taking their kids to soccer practice and all that kind of stuff. But let me go back to your comment about your daughter, because I think that's really kind of interesting. I was really encouraged that when I took a look, and again, this is media reports, so I wasn't there, but taking a look at the protests, most of the protests, particularly in Canada, particularly in some cities, not everywhere, were more than 50% white. So the people that were protesting against racism, against police brutality, were everybody. Now, they may have been young, they may have been your daughter's age, but that's gotta be a great example, leading indicator of what the future is going to be, is it not?
Absolutely. I mean, think about the pride parades, right? Pride parades for probably a decade have been people of all sexual orientations. Like, they stopped being parades just for the LGBTQ2 plus community long ago. I mean, I remember when Julian Fantino, the Toronto police chief, rode in the Pride Parade. And that was really a groundbreaker. The notion of allyship is really critically important, and I think you're right. Like, what we see on this issue is that increasingly issues of diversity and inclusion are not really about an individual's identity. So, the example David Onley always used to give is that 17% of citizens in Ontario have a disability, but 55%, and that would include me, have immediate family members with a disability. I'm not on the autism spectrum, but I have a nephew who is. If an organization is called out for mistreating people with autism, you can bet that's going to have an impact on my view of that organization. And I think we're seeing the same thing around, phenomena like Waiting While Black. If organizations get called out for mistreating Black customers, it's not just the Black population that is offended. It's many, 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 many more people. And the same is true with Islamophobia and et cetera, et cetera. So I do think we're seeing much more of this notion of allyship, that it's not just Indigenous people who are concerned about truth and reconciliation anymore. It's not just Black people who are concerned about anti-Black racism. And of course, that's part of what gave power to the civil rights movement way back I remember my father, I don't remember my father. I remember the story of my father taking a bus for 14 hours to Washington, D.C. to march with Martin Luther King.
Really? Fascinating. Do you have a picture of that?
No, I don't think so.
That's too bad.
But that notion of allyship and solidarity is really critical to making a difference. And I think that's why, initiatives like Black North, for instance, for me, are really encouraging, just as the 30% Club was, where you had a bunch of male CEOs standing up and saying, we're going to commit to gender equality. And with Black North, you have a bunch of CEOs standing up and saying, we're going to do better. Will they do as well as they should? Accountability and transparency becomes really, really important, because it's one thing to sign a pledge, it's another thing to deliver. And I do think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that the actions match the words.
No question. We're chatting tonight with Dr. Wendy Cukier, the professor at Ryerson University, the director of the Diversity Institute, someone who knows a lot about innovation. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. We're chatting about diversity tonight, and we've got Dr. Wendy Cukier, who is a professor at Ryerson, director of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson, and someone who has studied innovation and entrepreneurship for a long period of time. Wendy, I heard this great line. Let me ask you what you think of it. It was, diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Is there a big difference between diversity, and do we risk just, I think about this old line that Pierre Elliott Trudeau used about multiculturalism and the mosaic, but we didn't really get together. We were beautiful apart. Are we actually not only giving lip service to diversity, but actually including people in the decision-making process?
It's hugely important to make that distinction, and it's hugely important to really understand people's experiences and how it feels to them. And I think that for me was a real eye-opener in the research. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the stories. Some of the stories for me were really, really difficult. For example, there was, in one of our studies, we heard about a Muslim man who worked on Bay Street, And he used to go out drinking with his colleagues on, Friday night as is customary. And he told them he was a recovering alcoholic rather than admitting to being Muslim, because Muslims experience such pervasive Islamophobia. There was another guy we interviewed. People who are LGBTQ2 plus are almost invisible on boards. And I talked to Colin Druin, who's the head of Out at Work. And he said, we had a really hard time even finding anyone who would come on our panel who had been on a corporate board who was openly or out. And he said that aligned with his experience, because he said his queer mentors had told him, don't tell anyone until you are so successful that no one can get rid of you without someone noticing.
Well, I think about Mayor Watson in Ottawa, who lots of people rumored was gay, but it wasn't until his fourth term that he actually publicly admitted it.
Yeah, and when you think about what that means to somebody to live, and my father was a Holocaust survivor, and when he came to Canada, he concealed the fact he was Jewish. In fact, he was on his way with my mother to get his the marriage license. She thought his name was George Cook, and she told a story about how in the car he said, "I have something terrible to tell you." And she thought, "Oh my God, he's a bigamist. He's got, another wife. He killed somebody. What could it be?" And he looked at her and he said, "I am a Jew." And my mother was a small town girl from Northern Ontario who was Christian. My grandparents were fundamentalist and so on. And for her, it wasn't a big deal. But for him, it was shameful, terrible, horrible secret. And sadly, in small town Canada, those stories still exist.
What was the name on the marriage license?
I think he put his real name on the marriage license. I think I was a legitimate child.
I had a fascinating, you raised religion. I had a fascinating interview 2 weeks ago with a trans minister who was a male pastor at a Baptist church in Mississauga. And at the end of June, came out in a sermon that she identified as female. And it's interesting because I interviewed as well the retired minister at Metropolitan Community Church, which is known as a very progressive LGBT positive church. And he said it was interesting. He said she lost her position with a vote that was 52-48. And he said for a Baptist church in suburban Mississauga to actually vote 48% to keep her was a victory. What do you think of that?
Well, maybe. But
so human rights laws don't apply to faith communities, should they?
I don't know. Complicated question. But, I'm confident that she will find a place because, I think that reflects very much on the congregation. And, I know enough people in different faith communities who have different gender identities and sexual orientations that she's absolutely not alone. It's just, she picked the wrong congregation, I guess.
Wendy, we're almost out of time. You've done a lot of research in this area for numerous years. What's your message to my listeners tonight?
Don't be a bystander. Whether we're talking about sexual harassment, whether we're talking about racism, whether we're talking about Islamophobia, ableism, you name it, it only occurs because people let it occur. The fact that you may not yourself behave inappropriately, that you may not, harass people or be racist isn't enough anymore. If you observe bad behavior, microaggressions, you have to take action. And we also have to recognize that if you can't see it, you can't be it. So we have to really work hard to make sure that we correct these imbalances at the senior-most levels of our public and private sector if we're going to really create opportunities for all.
Dr. Wendy Cukier, the head of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson, professor at Ryerson, expert on innovation and diversity. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. And I do think that line that I quoted about diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being asked to dance, is really helpful. It sort of speaks to me, because I do think that too often we give all of these topics, which are really important topics, lip service. We study them, we announce them, we look at them. We don't call ourselves sexist or racist, or I liked your word ableist. I hadn't heard that before. But more than that, we've got to actually put, our money where our mouth is, or whatever the word is. Honorary doctorate Mohammed Faki, who I think is on one of your boards at Ryerson, he uses the line comparable to the diversity line that I just mentioned about diversity as being invited to the restaurant, but include